Okay, so this is me, my formal voice now. So I'm Alim Ozcan. I've been involved in service management for 25 years. I've had roles as a head of IT, managing hundreds of people, managing services to thousands of people. And in the last about 15 years, 13 to 15 years, I've worked as a service management consultant, primarily helping large financial institutions such as HSBC, Barclays Bank, Deutsche Bank, etc., along the lines of service design, transition, and operation. Process improvement is an area I specialize in, doing service management audits, CMMI, maturity assessments. A large area of focus has been around the people, processes, and the tools of service management, and in particular design, transition, and operation, and even service strategy and continual service improvement. So we could, if we choose to, depending on your questions, we can make this topic as wide as you want, but we'll try and focus on design, transition, and operation in particular. So that's me. So if at this point I could ask Surinder to just introduce yourself as well, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alim. My name is Surinder. So I'm a service designer. I've got quite extensive experience with large government departments in terms of doing SIAM transitions. So I've worked with the likes of HMT, MOJ, the Home Office, as a consultant working for a consultancy. So I've got a lot of kind of integration experience, which is quite unique in the sense that I've done more or less the larger service catalog design transition. So that's kind of where my remit lies.
Okay, thanks, Surinder. So the question's coming straight away, right? So let's do this. So many businesses have service transition, but not acceptance activation. Is this usually covered by the transition function? So many businesses have service transition, but not the acceptance activation. Okay, so let's address that. So great question, and keep them coming in. Thanks, Deborah. So for me, the acceptance is often done by service operations. Now, it can happen by the service transition team. So the service transition manager, the transition planning and support process, as it's known in ITIL v3, in v4 or in ITIL 4, they've got away with the transition planning and support process, and they actually have a project management process now in ITIL 4, just in case some of you weren't aware. But let's just stick to ITIL v3 for a second. So you may have a transition planning and support manager. If that person or that role, that team has the authority to accept the activation and to authorize it, then of course it could be that role doing it on behalf of service operations. But my experience is that often the transition planning and support manager manages the entire transition. So it engages with people in service design, okay, so the design planners, the service design package, and manage it all the way through, managing stakeholders, managing the transition processes such as change management, configuration management, etc. But the point of acceptance and activation is done at service operation, because essentially they want to ensure that they're not signing off and approving anything until they are completely comfortable. And the analogy that's often used is, don't throw it over the fence to the service desk and the service operations teams, which often happen, right? So that's for me where good practice dictates the acceptance and activation should happen. Let me just see if there's one other point I wanted to cover there. But let me stop there. Let me stop there to see if anyone disagrees, agrees, or has a subsequent question. And by all means, just unmute yourself and give your view.
I think I just asked that question because I worked I had a service design transition, the whole end to end, but then I moved to a bigger global company where I focused on acceptance. But there I sat firmly in service management, but I was the gatekeeper to operations. So making sure that everything in the project was, it was a governance role, making sure all the risks and things were called out and what have you. But I don't think they seem to have that role in many companies. That's why I was asking. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And that's before I get anyone else to come in, there's two other points that kind of prompts me on then, Deborah, to mention. One is that, of course, for this package, this service that's going to be introduced, service operations, in terms of good practice, and this is where I've seen it often go wrong, is when service operations are not involved at the very early stages in design, right? So they're happily getting away with doing, incidents, doing service management, service operation type stuff. And then perhaps the project's been going on for 3 months, or, the service is being developed for 3 months, 6 months. And then in the last couple of weeks, last 4 weeks, suddenly service operations is notified, oh, and by the way, we're going to release something to you. And then, I'm sure many of you have experienced that. It happens all too often. And then, of course, there's a big fight, and service operations say no, and we have to test this, and all of that kind of stuff. So it's, if the development of that service is happening in, say, January 2020, let's just take that as an example, and it's the release is planned for July 2020, then my view as good practice would be get service operations involved from at least January or February 2020, even if it's minimal. And what of course helps with this is, for any service that you're looking to introduce, have a RACI. So then we're clear who's accountable. So is it service operations are accountable for the activation and acceptance, as an example, but with service transition responsible, or vice versa? Then as long as those accountabilities are defined up front, then we're in good stead, aren't we? But yeah, get people involved early.
Yeah, I think that's where I found a lot of big challenges is getting them to accept that you need to be there at the beginning.
Yeah.
But it's paid dividends when I have. I've really pushed and explained the benefits and the purpose, and then people embrace it. So yeah, if you are doing those sort of roles, definitely push to get involved right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Review the design and everything. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Agreed. And so one company I assisted where it worked really, really well, if I could just say this, they had someone from their incident management team, or their service management team, actually having the accountability for their team. So they were a technical person, they were doing incident management, but they had accountability for their team for all service introductions. So having a role in that operations part of your organization, having some kind of responsibility, accountability for all service introductions, it was clear then that people involved in service design, service transition had to get this person involved from the start. So that helped. And therefore there was visibility all the way through. And then this person from the service operations team would then choose when to communicate to the wider service operations team. They'd either give them a brief update to say, oh, and there's a variety of these project services being introduced in 3 months' time. And then obviously when they got closer, they would just keep that communication. And then there was no blame culture, right? So the service operations team couldn't say to change management or in service design, oh, well, why didn't you tell us about this? Because they had a person who had the accountability in their own team. Anyway, so I hope that covers that area. We can come back to it. But so there's another question or comment. So as I was mentioning, early engagement of teams impacted or involved is required right when the requirements are raised and identified to ensure we get all necessary information impacts. This also helps in towards change efforts as well. Yeah. So he summed it up perfectly, in my opinion, right? And that's what I was covering. So let's open it up and see if there are any other kind of questions or comments that people want to make. Anyone want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I have a question. Karthik here.
Hi, Karthik.
Hi. How this is mainly used or applicable in banking environments? Like how, I just want to connect this in banking environment and see, because I basically come from agile transformation background. I'm an agile coach. So I just want to connect the dots and see how this can, because since you said we have to involve the operations team, the service people in the beginning, it's quite interesting to throw some light in terms of banking environment.
Okay. So, so thank you for the question, right? So good question. And remember, everyone, I'm giving you kind of generalist views about how I've seen it in the majority of organizations. I've also seen some very, very bad practices. And one of the jobs that I have is to go in and help organizations. So I guess what I'm kind of conveying to you is the good practice that I see, but there are many bad examples which you won't want to know about, right? That they're the ones that we should absolutely move away from. So in terms of good practice, kind of think, what I was explaining around having service design people, service transition people, and service operations people is the same in banking, right? So it's good practice. So whether you're in banking, in a not-for-profit organization, in transport, utilities, whichever organization you're in, it's good to have roles across the organization in all of these areas. And I'll cover some of the processes actually. I'll throw up a slide and I'll cover some of the roles that you need to ensure that you have. But I guess in answer to your question, it's the same in banking as it is for another industry organization. But it does also bring, before I kind of show up the slide, it does also remind me of another point I wanted to share with you where I've seen it work really well now in an agile environment. And I know that many of you, agile is a buzzword. Many of you are asking around agile. How's it different? What's the impacts on ITIL and on service design transition operation? So I'll try and kind of touch on that in terms of good practice that I've seen there, which hopefully will be good for some of you. So in this one particular bank, I won't name any names, they had to release updates to their service, right? So we're talking about services here. They had to release updates to their service, let's say every month. Okay, so small changes, medium changes. If there were longer changes, then maybe every 3 months. And therefore, instead of having the traditional, what often happens, the IT department managing all of design, transition, operation, and it all being centralized in the IT department, this particular bank had a lot of the service design and transition work happening actually on the client side, on the bank side, okay? And so there were resources in the IT department that were also service design people, service transition people, like change management, like asset and configuration management, but they also had a decentralized model where a lot of those processes and activities were done where essentially the customer was. But in this case, the customer, all internal customer, I don't mean externally. So what they were doing was they had, let's just talk about some roles, and I'll share a screen. Just give me a second. Let me just share my screen here. So I'm just going to bring up this slide, if I may. Okay. So on this slide, you'll see these are ITIL 4 processes. So this is a presentation I gave last week. So these are what's known as practices in ITIL 4. They're known as processes in ITIL v3. And I just wanted to select a couple. So ignore the yellow, right? Because as I said, this was from a presentation that I did before, but I just want to touch on some of these practices that are relevant for service design. So what we see here, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, but there's a service design process, a service catalog management process, availability management, capacity management. So some of the good core design activities that you need to have. So they all need to exist. And then you have the transition processes such as, not sure that happened. You have the transition processes such as release management, change enablement as it's known now, validation and testing, of course, right? So a lot of this hopefully will be common to you. So as I was saying, all of those processes were in the IT side, but they had small teams on the banking side also doing these activities, and they essentially ran them as sprint teams. So they had a team of 5 to 9 people, a team of 5 to 9 people as it would be, with accountability, or let's just say responsibility for capacity management, availability management, release management, change management. So it was all done on the banking side so that it could be dynamic, it could be in a sprint, they could focus because they were the people who knew the product, who knew the service, all at that area. But then as they got the product ready to be released, they would then actively engage with the IT people, also doing these roles. And then the thing that really worked for this organization is that they had their IT people also continually involved with their banking people to just be aware of what was happening, so that there wasn't this pushback when they were ready to release the product. Now, maybe I've kind of explained that, not too well, because obviously I'm just talking from these slides here, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's the same in banking as it is for anywhere else. But if you're using an agile concept, then actually you might find that you're doubling up on some of the roles, but just to a lesser extent, where they, each of the roles from the different areas have to work together, if that makes sense and helps. Okay, I was also going to go on to this next slide. Where is it? In a bit. Okay, so this is changes from ITIL v3 to 4, which I will cover in a second, but I'll just come out of presenting view. And actually, I could probably stay there. Let me just see if there's a question on what I've said before I cover what I wanted to on this slide. So anyone who wants to unmute themselves and make a comment or ask a question. Okay, Surinder, before I cover these slides, is there anything else that you want to add to what I've said so far on any aspect?
Yeah, so there's just one point I wanted to cover, and it's more from a design perspective and how I've worked as a designer. So, and to answer Karthik's question as well, I think it's important to get buy-in. So if you begin that process of getting operations involved into, transition teams, whatever you have set up, I think that is one of the success factors, and it actually influences how great the success is. If that's done from the very beginning, then I think you're probably going to be in a better position when you get to service acceptance or service introduction, in terms of how well the service actually does technically and also operationally. So that's very, very important. And I've also been on the other side where that engagement hasn't taken place, and I joined the project quite later on and seen that there was no engagement. So my job as a designer and also a people's person is to get people involved from operations. So look at what roles and personas you have within the organization and see where they fit in when you're trying to set up these teams and get them engaged. And I think that's agile or not, I think it just brings so much more out. So that's just the one thing I really wanted to hone in on in terms of transition. I think it's very important to do that. And also the other one point I was going to make earlier on was there are, in a lot of organizations that I've worked with, there are usually, I've been in about 5 now, so out of the 5, 3 have had transition planning support teams where the transition managers have sat. So I think it was Deborah's question about the service acceptance criteria as well. So that for me has always sat in transition, and the transition planning support team and the transition managers are the ones who take it into operations. But then we've got that fine line of getting it across the line, as Alim was saying earlier, into operations and making sure everything works. So you don't want to throw or flog something over that's broken or not fit for purpose. So it's really important that, I think that's the most important part of any transition, is to make sure that it's A1, and that whole list, which if somebody wants to see what the actual criteria looks like, I can provide that. But to make sure that everything is ticked off on there and is fit for purpose is really important. So they're just the 2 points I wanted to make on the back of the conversation we've just had.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, so one of the things I used to do was not take over completely, but it's so when the project manager need to present about the project and say, this is how it's going to work, these are the things we need to do, I would help with that. I would set up the slides with him, make sure that all the right people from the service areas were all involved. So everybody knew right from the start, this is where they could get in at the start. A lot of the times you are thrown in at the end just to save a project. But yeah, that kick-off meeting, if you can drive that with the project manager's support, then that does get a lot of help. And then meet separately with everybody then to say, you know, what's your criteria? What's your acceptance criteria to get this over the line?
Yeah, and that's absolutely it, and Deborah, because you should never be, in inverted commas, saving a project, because you can save all that aggro.
Yeah,
It's already set up, right?
Yeah. Thank you. So Azhar, I see you've asked a question. Can you just clarify what AIS means, please? Azhar, you can either unmute yourself or in the chat. Acceptance, okay. So who should lead the acceptance into a service? So what I'll do is I'll give my view, but I'll actually open it up to all of you. You know, so anyone in terms of what happens in your areas, what you've seen works, etc. Because of course it could be different, and I'm going to say a role for me, you know, a traditional role that leads acceptance into service, but of course I should caveat that with. It depends in your organization whether that role has the accountability or not, what responsibilities, are they full-time, is there a role which, even though they don't have the same job title, is more appropriate. So, you know, of course it could be, you know, any variety of roles, right? It could be the head of service management. So it just depends on your organization. But in my experience, what I've seen often lead the role, and this isn't an ITIL term necessarily, it's just one that was used for the last 10, 15 years in various organizations. There was a role that was often known as the service introduction manager. So not necessarily a formal role in ITIL, but one that maybe many of you have come across. So perhaps the service introduction manager leads the acceptance into service. From an official, ITIL perspective, then the transition planning and support process in ITIL v3 is the equivalent of that role. Now, for some organizations, though, it may be the release and deployment manager, right? So it just depends. It just depends on the role's remit. But there are three roles that I've seen. So either the release and deployment manager, where they have a wider remit than just doing release. It should be the transition planning and support manager. That's the process. Or, as I said, often it's known as the service introduction manager. But let's open it up, especially for anyone that we haven't heard from thus far, for you to give your views and see what happens in your organization. Who leads service introduction or service acceptance for you? Anyone want to share their experiences? Remember to unmute yourself. Don't be shy. We're in this all together. Anyone? Okay. So
I'll just speak just because nobody else has.
I think Praveen has just saved you at the last minute, Deborah. Maybe. Okay. So Praveen, I saw you come off on mute. Do you want to share your experience?
Absolutely. Based on my role, hello everyone. Based on my role, the currently role, what I'm doing is post the project team is about to complete their project related activities, and when they hand it over, or when they basically hand over the their bit of project into operations, there are what I've noticed, there are no basically predefined criterias from what I saw in the current organization, just to be very frank. But again, it depends upon what we're looking at, basically the SLA targets, and what are the response times, are there any known issues which are open. So that's where things have been focused in my current organizations. But again, yes, it would be helpful if there is a predefined list, or if there are any important areas which needs to be covered based on each service, because from what I understand is each service, say for example, let it be an application service, let it be a network, hosting, database, every service will be different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if somebody can share some light or probably a list
So we'll
for
cover
the
that.
SAC.
Yeah. So probably thank you for that. So we'll cover that then, right? So we'll see if Deborah and Surinder and others want to just continue commenting on acceptance into service. But then we'll also cover the kind of, I think what I understood from your question, the wider roles and the accountabilities that could exist, and how maybe an organization should be structured around service management, or could be structured, I should say, right? But thanks. So hold on to that question. Deborah, you wanted to come in and give your view?
Yeah, I would just say, so my role was focused on acceptance, although I did transition as well. So I used to lead that into service. So what I'd do is have a service acceptance board, and basically it's presenting to the service director and the service manager saying, this is what you're going to take. All the stakeholders would all be involved. So the incident problem, whatever services the customer wants to pay for, would also be part of that audience. And then would support the project manager who was presenting to the service director to say, this is how it's all done, this is what's sorted. And my role is just to make sure I brought everything out onto the table so they knew exactly what they're getting. But, if there were problems, risks and issues. So I led that as an acceptance person, but obviously it works in lots of different ways in different organisations depending on how they structure it all.
Yeah. And Surinder, before I let you come in as well, Deborah, you've just reminded me about a point that I should mention, and which also helps answer the question, in that I was thinking of it just as an internal organization. So, we're all internal, the service management teams are internal, the services are internal, etc. But of course, it could be that we are a service provider to an external organization. And so in that case then, and this is, just I'm mentioning this to everyone, then of course, the acceptance, the approval, going back to the earlier question, would happen from the customer, right? So we're a service provider, we're developing services, we want to implement services. It has to be the customer and either their service operation team or their transition planning and support manager that would be accountable for the acceptance, right? So it would be on the customer side, but we would have our own equivalent as if we're the service provider, our own internal resources going through the different steps of design, transition, and operation, because we wouldn't want to get to the customer with a product that's not going to be accepted. So we would have our own acceptance people, but then if you like, there'd be a second stage where of course the customer accepts it. And then on the customer side, it might not be the service operation team, as I was alluding to before. It might be their service transition team or their project management team, or some board on the customer side that does the acceptance into that organization, into that customer. Okay, so just thought I'd mention that. Surinder, on what's been discussed so far, any comments that you want to add?
Yeah, so just on that, it's absolutely essential. I had the word mandatory yesterday, which I liked, so I'd use that again. So I would say it's absolutely mandatory that you get the customer on board and make sure that the customer is kind of giving you that acceptance criteria ticked off as well, because again, I go back to my example from yesterday, and one that we can all relate to. So we as customers, when we go into a restaurant and we order, we are the ones looking at the menu. So the menu is designed for us as customers. So that's just from a design perspective. So we have to make sure that even when we've got the design done and the product ready for transition, it's what the customer actually wants, because you don't want to give them something which they're not going to like or not going to be happy with, because then you get other things come out in operation. So you want to mitigate any kind of risks beforehand. So yeah, I'm just kind of reiterating, what Deborah and Alim have already said. But yeah, there's another quite interesting question that's come in I've just seen Michael.
So we'll get on to that, Surinder, because I want to go back to, so I saw Michael's question, so we'll come to that because it's a very good question, very interesting. But I just want to cover Praveen's point from earlier first, before we move on to Michael's question. So I'm just going to go back to the previous slide I was on, this one. So I think, Praveen, if I understood your question, it was around working in an organization where it's quite unstructured, you know, maybe the roles and responsibilities, the RACI hasn't been defined, and therefore what could be done in that area. And I'll kind of mention two key things from my perspective before we go on to Michael's question in the chat. So one is that for the different services that you have, the different teams that you have to build a RACI. So you have to build that roles and responsibilities. You have to make it clear who's accountable, that one person, or that, you know, one person for that one particular part. And then who are the responsible people, and who are the people that you need to consult, and who are the people that you need to inform. You have to have that kind of structure. Otherwise, everyone is all over the place and people don't know who's doing what, right? So that sounds like the situation that you were alluding to. And then I just want to touch on groupings from here. So sometimes I'm asked, but look, there are 34 practices here. There are 26 processes in ITIL v3, if that's what you're focused on. And people say, but you know, our organization is too small, or we can't have that much structure or whatever to have a person for each of these processes, right? So we can't have 26 people just doing this. They're all doing other stuff. So some of the groupings that you can look at, and I'll just give a few examples from my experience where it works well. So service level management, as an example, and supplier management are two areas that might be grouped together, because you're managing your suppliers and the service level agreements from your suppliers, and then your own internal service level agreements too, may go hand in hand. That could be a person that takes on both of those practices, as an example. And then if we look at, let's see, what else? Oh, continual improvement, right? So we have a continual improvement process. So continual improvement, measurement and reporting, relationship management. There are some more processes that sometimes go well, where, you know, a person could be doing that together, right? So looking at the measurements and reports and driving continual improvement. And then I'll just give one more, because there's, you know, many examples I could give. Often, depending on the size of the organization, release management, change enablement, as you see it here, the new name in ITIL 4 rather than change management, but essentially they're the same. So release management, change management, service configuration management, as you see here, and also asset management. Those 4 practices, maybe even with validation and testing, depending on the organization's size, may all be done by one accountable person. Now, that's not what I would say is good practice, but of course it depends on the organization. But there's some groupings that you might do to help bring some structure to perhaps a chaotic environment. At least, you know, and then if you're using a maturity model from level 1 to 5, with 1 being, you know, the most chaotic and 5 being the best. In a chaotic organization, then once you're doing that maturity assessment, you may find, of course, that you're just at level 1, right? It's chaotic, things aren't followed, etc. But at least that gives you a model to try to go to perhaps level 2, or to at least cement what's at level 1. So using some kind of structure to do improvements like that and bring some accountability and roles and responsibilities, I find is key. It's the number 1 place that I focus on. It's around people, essentially, far more than processes or systems. Whereas when I often go into an organization, when I'm called in, their focus normally is on tools. So they have a service management tool already, and they think more often than not that if we just replace our service management system, because they've told us that this one has bells and whistles and it's much faster and better, that our problems will go away. Well, that's just the marketing people from the various tool vendors saying that. If you replace a tool with another tool, it changes nothing. In my experiences, it's where the focus has to be on the roles and responsibilities. Okay. Now, of course, it depends again. You know, if an organization has great structure, roles and responsibilities defined, then it may be processes that they need to focus on or on tools. I just wanted to make that point to see if that was helpful for some of you. Okay, so I hope that kind of answers the question. If it doesn't, Praveen, you can come back later. But let's move on to Michael's question in the chat. And Surinder, I'll let you go first on this because you are getting ready to start on this one, right? So I'll let you go first, and then obviously others can come in as well. So I have some views, as I'm sure Deborah and others will have. So let me just kind of paraphrase the question. So essentially what I've understood from Michael's question is he's saying that he worked in an organization which was really structured, lots of formality, lots of processes, let's just assume working really well. And he's now working with an organization, maybe I think he may have mentioned a startup, but just, maybe an organization that's newly formed or is more immature in their processes, maybe a startup. And in comparison, they don't have as many processes. There's not as much structure. And that when Michael is trying to bring some structure to this organization, they use the agile way of batting him away, right? So which a lot of organizations do, but we're working in agile way, etc. So, so he's asking any examples of how best to deal with these kind of organizations where, yes, they do need to work in agile way. Maybe they are a startup, maybe they're only an organization of 20 or 30 people, but they still need some structure, of course, because otherwise, especially as they scale, things will be chaotic. So Surinder, do you want to go first, please?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for the question, Michael. So so the first point I want to make is I'm not really too happy saying that a scale or size of an organization dictates whether it essentially works or not, because I have been in startups. It's about behaviors, and I keep saying it's behaviors and how we drive the behaviors. I think if the behaviors are driven in a way, even if it is agile, I think that, I've worked agile throughout my 6 or 7 year career now in IT. And even if it is agile, even if it is a startup, and I've been in SIAM environments in a startup, I think it's still possible to execute something, that is quite big, but still done with your 20 or 30 people. It's doable, but it's how it's set up and how you execute it. So I would really kind of hone into the idea of making sure that, the races are in place and people know what their responsibilities are, what they're accountable for, who's being consulted, etc., just to be on the right page. Because if it doesn't work like that, it's never going to work, and it's never going to give you, success that you actually want to get out of anything. So the point I was trying to get to was that it doesn't, in my eyes, it doesn't really matter whether it's a startup or an established bank or, anywhere in finance. It's how you do it, as to how good it is. I've worked in organizations where you can have 100 people and still have rubbish churned out at the end of it. So again, are we saying that size, of an organization matters? Are we saying that, a business that's been established but has broken processes that are not willing to change, again, it goes to behaviors, and this influences, I think, to a very large extent how we execute something. So I have, again, been in businesses where they're very used to things. They don't like change. Driving change, getting the buy-in, again, is something that, is really, really essential. One thing I haven't mentioned, and I've just literally thought of, is, and I was on a course earlier this year for service design and service lifecycle, and I remember the trainer telling us about relationship managers. And I've worked in one organization where there was an RM within the business, and other organizations been absent. But I can say that one RM that I had, or the relationship manager in that one business, was driving a lot of change, a lot of behavior between the client and the business, and was the kind of go-between. And that's something I haven't seen before. So again, let's take the size out here, and let's take out the fact that, you know, it's a startup. It's irrelevant to some large degree, I think, my opinion, and it's my humble opinion, so please don't be offended. Doesn't really matter. It's what you do within the organization and how you drive that change. I think if you have 5 good people, you could probably transition something really great. And if you had 50 people who did nothing, right? So, or did something, but did it in a very, you know, archaic way, for example, which is not sitting right with what your processes are or what you're trying to achieve. So again, I go back to, as a designer, I'm going back to business, the actual business design principles and the actual processes that are already in place, and how you drive that change and get the buy-in. Buy-in, I keep saying this, is the most important part of anything. Once you've got buy-in, everything else seems to fall in place and makes everything a lot easier than it is. I think you can, just by doing something, you know, kick-off meetings, like we said before, and just getting people engaged. Because if you engage someone, we as humans are programmed to feel special sometimes within a business, right? So if someone comes and asks us something and gets our opinion on it, we're going to be like, oh, okay, yeah, I've been asked that question, right? So I'm actually going to be interested, and I'm going to engage a bit more. They're not going to be so reluctant when you get to transition to do that. So getting those people around the table, I say, even if they're not part of the deal, just getting them in the conversation to begin with. You may, you know, want to drop them at a later stage, but doing that and being a bit more diplomatic and treating them the way you want to be treated as well, right? It works wonders, and might be a bit of reverse psychology, but it works. And you know, it's not to say that when you get to transition, you discount those people, not at all. You've got to treat them as your customer, because in effect, some people within the business are, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Surinder. And a box of chocolates helps, right? But
That was too.
yeah. So I'll just make a couple of points, right? And we'll see if there's, you know, other people that want to engage on this. And I know Jackie and some other people are writing in the chat, so that's helpful. So thanks for, and Deborah's as well. So for me, so, you know, I completely agree with Surinder, of course, and a lot of it is around attitude and buy-in and all the points that she mentioned. But I think depending on the organization as well, we have to just accept the situation, right? And I want to give a kind of a real life example of an organization I was supporting where they were a startup. Okay, so they're a startup organization, and I'm a process person, I'm structured, etc. But this organization had received funding. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I need to tell you a bit of the context. They received funding. I think they had about a $5 million grant to do something and it was a telecoms organization. It's around unified communications, etc. So they had this $5 million grant. So they had money, but essentially they were just going to be a team of 20 people or so. And I was brought in to help them with their processes and to provide some structure for them. And so in that organization, I had to make a choice in that, you know, I'm showing you deliberately on screen that there are 34 practices now in ITIL 4. When ITIL, one of the earlier versions of ITIL, ITIL version 2, as some of you will be familiar with, had 10 core processes. And these 10 core processes focus more around kind of operational processes, really. There's some design processes there, but operation, and they were the real core processes. And so what I found that I had to do for this organization is really get back down to basics as to where do they need to prioritize, what's going to be the main focus for them in terms of giving them the biggest benefit, because it can't be that they do all of this, of course. So there had to be some prioritization. So the processes of course, incident management, change management, configuration management, so you know where your assets are and what the configuration items for those assets are, and reporting, because of course you'll have to do some form of KPIs reporting. And I won't go into some of the others, but you know, some core processes they had to focus on. And they're the ones that I made sure there was accountability and ownership on. And they were the ones that they were going to give it their full focus. And then to just, but still knowing that they were going to have all kinds of teething problems. They were still going to have issues. They were going to have issues well into another year or two with everything else that they were trying to do in terms of just trying to establish the business as well. You know, processes weren't going to take much focus when they're actually trying to stay alive, you know, survive. So to help them with that, I made sure that there were 2 service improvement meetings, 2 continual improvement meetings to deal with those things that absolutely were going to go wrong, right? But for them to just focus on it very quickly to bring about improvements and changes. And then by involving everyone or the majority of people in those service improvement meetings, that buy-in aspect that Surinder touched on would also be worked on in that, look, such and such went wrong. I know, look, guys, I know this is reactive, but you know, this was appropriate for this organization. So such and such went wrong. We didn't go through change management, for example. Someone took something out of the switch without telling us, and we can't let that happen again. What do we do? So then as part of that service improvement, it was clear, everyone was like, okay, right, so we can never have that happening again. So for these types of changes, we have to have this CAB, we have to have this change management meeting, even if it's just 2 or 3 people saying yes or no. So I don't know. So look, I hope that helps, but you know, some reality into prioritization. You can't do everything. Small organization, or maybe they're an organization of 500 people, but they're quite new, quite dynamic still. It's just about focusing on what you can achieve and what's going to give them the biggest return on their investment and their buy-in. So I hope that helps. Any other thoughts from anyone on what we've discussed? Before I go on to a slide that I've been showing you a couple of times that I haven't gone into. So I want to cover this slide, but anything else on what we've discussed so far from anyone before I cover this slide? Anyone want to unmute themselves? No? Okay. So let me cover this slide then. Let me just check on time. So I'll cover this slide and then we'll see if there are any other questions or points that people want to raise. So this slide I teased you with, this is just showing on the right-hand side, really, I want to focus on the diagram of what's known as the service value chain in ITIL 4, okay? The service value chain, you see it here in this slide here, in this middle, but on the right-hand side, it opens up as to, well, what's in that service value chain. And I'm showing you this slide to essentially show you that ITIL 4 is very similar to ITIL v3 in that it still has, you'll see here, design and transition, and it still has deliver and support. And of course, you have to either obtain it or build it. You need to implement it, right? So many of the practices, as you saw on my previous slide, are still very, very similar in ITIL 4 as they are in ITIL v3. And I'm mentioning this so that kind of demystifies some of, you know, people thinking, oh, but ITIL 4, it's got this service value chain, and what is this? And it's all new concepts. And actually, when you get to the core of it, it's not. And here in this diagram here at the top, one that many of you will be familiar with, this round diagram, is what you often saw in ITIL v3, right? And it covered service strategy, design, transition, operation, CSI. So as I said, although it's not called the service lifecycle anymore in ITIL 4, many of the concepts and the processes are still there in the same way. The real kind of change, what I believe Axios wanted to do with ITIL 4 is focus on value and co-creation, as you see here, okay? Now, if you're following ITIL v3 to a good mature level, then of course you would still focus on value. Of course you would still focus on customer, but what they're looking to do in ITIL 4 is just bring this out, you know, just bring this out to the top. In that's what it's all about. So if you have the opportunity and demand, so some opportunity, some demand for a service, you then of course engage, maybe through your business relationship management practice, or, you know, whichever practice, whoever's managing that area. So you engage, of course, and then you see here plan and improve. So still CSI, and still planning it. And then you design and transition, you obtain and build, you deliver and support the products and services that you see in blue to drive value for your customer. Okay, so in that regard, it doesn't make any difference whether it's V3 or ITIL 4. Okay, I hope that helps with some. I see a chat has come in. Okay, that's just private, so that's fine. So look, we have about 5 minutes, I think. One thing I would like to do now, if you don't all mind, is just to ask everyone to turn on their cameras and give us a wave, just so that's part of this session as well. So I hope you all do your part, especially if you have enjoyed at least parts of this session and had your questions answered. So that's great. Thank you for that. So I'll keep this screen on. I'm not showing anything else. So we have a few minutes left. I hope you found it beneficial. So thanks for joining, and all happy smiley faces. So that means we must have done something right. But look, with the last few minutes left, does anyone disagree with anything that's been said? Is there any query, comment that you have that you would like to get across and answered? Please remember to unmute yourselves if you do. No.
Alim, it's Praveen
Yes.
here.
Hi, Praveen. Yes.
Maybe, yeah. If we all can get probably the list of SAC criteria, or probably the important ones, what needs to be focused or looked at when the service is being transitioned from a project into operations, we at least can probably do some pre-checks. I would not say the entire list, because everything depends upon the service and what the demand is and what the project is all about. So at least some basic ones that we can at least.
You mean a checklist, Praveen?
Yeah.
Or you mean
A checklist for SAC,
introduction?
and at least some important ones which we can focus when a service is being transitioned from project to operations.
Okay.
So I was just going to say, Alim, Praveen, I have something I created for someone in the mentors group. So I can send you something. It's generic, and that should help you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks,
So
Surinder.
what I'll do, so when Surinder shares it with me, I have your email addresses when you're all registered. I will send this all out to all of you. So you'll all have this service introduction to operation checklist. Okay. So thanks, Surinder. Thanks for saying. Okay. So I hope some of you will find that useful. Any other templates that you want? You have 1 minute to ask. Is there anything else that will help you in your role?
SAC template.
SAC, service acceptance criteria.
So the checklist, we could provide that. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Service acceptance criteria you will have. Anything else? Anything else? This is your chance to ask.
Within reason.
Yeah, within reason. Related to service management only. Don't ask for bribes or money or anything else. Okay.
I would not be selfish enough. So these are the two areas which I thought I would need help on. Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, I will share that. No problem.